Hello family, thank you for tuning into this video today. I appreciate you, and look, I hope you get some really good value out of what's going to be covered. What I want to talk about today is the 5 unique traits that the best suburbs in regional Queensland have. And look, if you're someone that I suppose is looking for their next investment property in regional Queensland, but you're struggling to sort of figure out where the best suburbs are or where's the best place to invest, I think this is going to really help you, right? Because it's going to really give you the lens, I suppose, that you need to put over your eyes and to analyze the suburb from. And look, this has helped me secure more than $250 million worth of residential real estate across regional Queensland by making sure that the suburbs we target filter through these 5 traits. So I believe if you are an investor today, you're going to get some tremendous value out of this discussion. Cheers, guys, and I appreciate you. Now, if you are a current subscriber, thank you for tuning in again. If you are new to the channel, for those that don't know me, my name is Troyson Bassini. I'm the owner and head of research of Life Buyers Agency. Now, Life Buyers Agency, we're an on-the-ground buyers agent that specialises in the regional Queensland property market, and we operate under 2 distinct brands here. In Central Queensland, we're operating under Capricorn Life, and we're servicing the Rockhampton, Mackay, Gladstone and Bundaberg region, and then up in North Queensland, Cairns and Townsville, and the surrounding areas, we're operating under Tropical Life Buyers Agency. And look, guys, as I said before, we have secured a lot of property across the marketplace, more than $250 million worth over the last 6.5 years. And yeah, we're still helping many people navigate these markets. So I suppose if you're an investor that is struggling to potentially buy into these markets or just haven't really figured out where to buy, when to buy, and what to buy, then I think it might be worthwhile having a chat with us. We might be able to try and steer you in the right direction at least, or potentially help you get into the marketplace with one of our various service options. So you can visit us on that website there, give us a call on that number. We've got active social media pages as well. You can check those out under any of those brand names there as well. Now, as I said, for the last 6.5 years, I've operated the buyer's agent business, and I've been lucky enough to, secure more than $250 million worth of residential real estate in these markets. Now, what you have to do, and this is, something that I make sure that me and my team are doing in-house, is that we have a criteria in terms of how we vet and screen a suburb. And I think that's important because it allows you to just see through a lot of the bullshit and cut through a lot of the noise that's out there, because there can be a lot of noise and it can be quite deafening when you're consuming so much different research and data, property news in relation to certain suburbs and areas. And unfortunately, that can sometimes get the best of you, and it can actually stop you from taking action. It could cause what's called analysis paralysis, or it can just completely scare you off that you never take action and unfortunately go on to miss out on some potentially really good upside that suburb had for you. Now, this framework that we use here consists of 5 key metrics that we're looking at, and that is to ensure that, again, we are cutting through all of that noise. So when we are analyzing a suburb, number 1, what we're first and foremost doing is looking out for a thing called owner-occupier appeal. And that's can be defined as pretty much a suburb that appeals and has a lot of desirability for people that want to live there, right? People want to put down roots there. They want to establish themselves in that suburb. They want to live there. So that's what the term owner-occupier appeals means. And look, why this is important is because owner-occupiers drive a marketplace, right? Across Australia, they make up more than 70 or 80% of the total transaction volume across Australia. So if you don't have a property, or you're not in an area where it appeals to the owner-occupier market that make up the greatest market depth, then unfortunately there for you, it's probably not going to be the best investment property, because these owner-occupiers are the ones that are getting emotionally attached to property. They are coming into these transactions emotionally charged, and they have a tendency to drive up prices over time. But at the same time, given that they make up a big percentage of the transaction volume, they provide the greatest market depth for you as well. So in the event that you may have to liquidate down the track, right, you do have market depth there. There'll be an owner occupier, 10, 20, 30 of them lining up to snap up your property because you've targeted a suburb or an area where people want to live. So owner occupiers make up a big portion of the transaction volume in the marketplace, and they provide the greatest market depth. So it gives you really good investment security and stability, knowing that if there is a change in the marketplace and you have to liquidate, or you have a change in circumstances, you have to liquidate, or it gets to that point in time where you just wanted to liquidate to cash in on your investment anyway, there is pent up demand there already because people want to live in that area. So that's pretty much the owner occupier appeal lens that we're looking at uh, the suburb through. So things you want to look out for and investigate when you're trying to determine if a suburb has good owner occupier appeal is number one, the owner occupier percentages. And what we like to do is try and target suburbs where the ratio is greater than 65% of the stock. So what that means is, let's say there's 3,000 dwellings, right, in a suburb. What we want is 65% of those dwellings, those 3,000 dwellings, to be owned by owner occupiers. Now, why this is the case is because what that gives is great market stability. Because when you have a suburb per se that has an owner occupier percentage less than 50%, that's when you know it's probably not as desirable or as appealing to the owner occupier market. So you want to target these areas where that percentage is high, and that's very easy data to find as well. You can find majority of these owner occupier percentages on, I think, CoreLogic or realestate.com or Domain. So Domain has some suburb profile data you'd be able to extract this information from to determine if, yeah, their own occupier percentages are healthy. And as I said, anywhere above 65% is generally very healthy. And then as I start to drill deeper into the suburb itself, we want to target pockets and streets. That's where my ratio starts to become higher. So when I'm drilling down into certain pockets, that ratio jumps from 65 to 80%. And then when I'm looking at individual streets, that jumps from pretty much 80% to 85 to 100% owner occupier rate. So that's important, guys. And as I said, that's going to really set you up in an area where there is really good stability, market depth, and overall desirability because those rates are so high. Another thing you want to look at is the data around hold period. So how long are people generally holding properties for in the suburb? And what we want is a ratio generally greater than 8 years. Now, what that means is that people that are holding their properties for a relatively long time there means, well, it says to me anyway, that they're generally pretty happy there, right? They don't want to sell up and move. They're quite happy there to hold properties for a long period of time. And that in itself also creates a finite amount of supply. When you have a lot of people in those areas withholding stock from the market, it can create a lot of ongoing desirability and pent up demand because of that limited supply levels and hold periods. As I said, the longer the hold period, the healthy amount generally sits between 8 to 12 years. I find when it sits in that sweet spot, you're in a really good market that has really strong owner occupier appeal where people are generally happy. When it starts to move a lot less than 8 years, what I find is you're moving into markets where people, and property are changing hands more frequently. And to me, that just speaks people aren't happy there. They don't have any stability. There might be a high portion of investor-owned stock there as well. So when investors get spooked of any economic downturns or shocks or change in market environment, they tend to sell their properties. So the turnover time is a lot less. So you want to make sure you target these areas again with 8 years and above. And you can find this information as well for free on portals like realestate.com and Domain with their suburb profile information and data as well. Now, a few other things you want to look at from an owner-occupier appeal perspective is obviously the location. The location is really going to play into how appealing it is, and the location needs to have either schools, parks. It needs to be relatively close to the CBD or major job hubs. Has to have some like really good lifestyle drivers there, like ocean creeks or walkways, things like that that make it really good in terms of the overall location. And then another thing is things like land size as well. So land size could be a really good gauge as to whether a location has owner occupier appeal or not. Like for example, most people, particularly in regional Australia, they like to have a minimum of 600 square meters. And then the greater the land capacity, obviously, the more versatility you get out of that land. And what we find is that land tends to get a lot bigger as you move from the inner middle ring to the outer middle ring, and then obviously from residential to rural residential and to really remote or rural residential. The land parcels turn from sort of small residential blocks to acreage lots and then hectares. Um, so yeah, think about land size as well because that can really determine, you know, whether or not that particular property or suburb has owner occupier appeal. Because I know there are a lot of suburbs across regional Queensland where what you'll actually find is that they're well located, but the land content is relatively small there. Like you can get properties that sit on less than 600 square meters of land and down to as small as 450 square meters. And this is the case in parts of Townsville, parts of Mackay, parts of Rockhampton, even parts of Bundaberg. So that really plays into whether or not that has owner occupier appeal. And what I find is that properties with the larger land content tend to have the more stronger owner occupier appeal. But that's married in with a bunch of these other factors I just mentioned there that make it a really good location. So that, again, schools, parks, transport time, and then all those key lifestyle drivers as well. And then the last two here is low rental stock slash availability. So you want really low vacancy rates. And again, that speaks to and it ties back into that own occupier percentage. Generally, when that ratio is a lot lower, that means that it has a greater portion of investor owned stock there. So what that means is an increase in vacancy rates. And when you have like areas where there's very high levels of vacancies, then that means that from an investment perspective, you're not getting the premium quality rents, and then you have a lot of competing properties there at any given time. So really, you're not maximizing the rental upside potential of that investment. So what you want to do is target areas where that amount or that vacancy rate is really low, and you can check out those vacancy rates pretty easy on most platforms, realestate.com and Domain for free, where you'd be able to gauge whether or not those vacancy rates are healthy or not. And what you actually want to see is vacancy rates sort of constantly as a long-term trend sit around that 1 or 1.5%. And if it's even trending a lot less than that over a long-term average, then that's when you know you're in a rental market where there is very limited rental stock because the large portion of the properties that are owned, they're actually owned by the owner occupiers themselves. And that's a really good thing when it comes to making sure that this box is ticked to ensure that you're going to maximize your upside potential for capital growth. And the last thing is when you're investigating the suburbs that have the owner occupier appeal is look for suburbs where there is a lot of boutique homes and not spec homes. So what you'll actually find is across a lot of suburbs in regional Queensland, a large portion of the stock there will be built to what's called investment spec or just your general spec home. So there's nothing fancy about them, and they're built in large volumes that have, and these properties have very little differentiation amongst each other. And majority of these properties were built in order to supply stock to investors as opposed to own occupiers. So they generally are 422 brick homes or 322 brick homes that have the same facade, roughly the same floor plans, but there's only one or two things that might differentiate themselves from a couple of other properties on that same street that are spec homes themselves. What you want to target instead are suburbs where there's a lot of boutique homes. So these were properties that were actually built by homeowners, people that want to live on those properties as opposed to rent them out because they're going to want those bigger rooms, they're going to want those bigger bathrooms, they're going to want nicer finishes, they're going to want space and access for boats, caravans, pools, etc. So when you find suburbs that have those more boutique homes at an aggregate level, you're entering into an area where the owner occupier appeal, I believe, is greater because owner occupiers love those boutique homes more than they like the spec homes. Those spec homes are generally only purchased out of affordability or necessity if you were to pick a spec home versus a boutique home, you're going to pick a boutique home every day of the week. So look out for all of those key things, guys. And remember, if you are evaluating a suburb, consider its owner occupier appeal. All right, now the next thing we like to look for when we're evaluating a suburb is a thing called scarcity. Now, what that means is pretty much it's in its name, right? We're trying to find areas that are scarce, right? Where there is limited amount of housing in that stock or only a finite amount of housing stock. Because what you'll actually find is that there are areas that are already what's called established built out areas, and there are areas or suburbs where there is still an abundance of land as far as the eye can see, where there is a pipeline of new supply. Now, they always say, and this is 101 property investing, supply is the enemy of capital growth. And I can attest to that because I've seen it happen across regional Queensland. Definitely the suburbs where there is only a finite amount of supply have a tendency to outperform the suburbs where there is a pipeline of new supply. Look, there might be suburbs right now that are hot, that have a pipeline of new supply, that are going through big growth cycles throughout regional Queensland. And look, that's okay. And that's totally fine. If you want to take a punt on those suburbs, that's totally fine. But what you have to be mindful of is what is the long-term outlook for that suburb? And is that pipeline of new supply going to pose a potential long-term risk to my asset? Because that amount of supply is likely to create a lot of competition going forward. Whereas if you have something that's more finite in nature, obviously that's where you can start to charge a premium for that particular asset. So scarcity, it's in the name, and what we want to do is find suburbs that are scarce in nature. And then obviously when you start to drill down from a suburb level then into pockets and streets, and you start to apply the same lens where you're finding the better, scarcer pockets within a suburb and the better streets, that's when you're starting to really get into the granular detail of picking the sort of diamonds from the rocks in the marketplace. And that's where the best performing assets can be found, when you're also applying this lens and digging deeper into the layers of the onion of the suburb. So I think if you can apply this when you're out there finding your next suburb and apply this in a way where you can get to the street level and property level scarcity, you'll definitely outperform, guys, that's for sure. Now, a couple of things to look out for to determine whether or not you're targeting a suburb that is scarce is, number one, is it an established suburb? So you can quickly find that out when you're looking at even the suburb from a bird's eye point of view. If you're geographically challenged and you're not on the ground, what you can simply do is jump on Google Maps, look at the suburb level, get a bird's eye view of it, and what you'll actually see is that is there available land there? And then if you can see available land there, drill down deeper and say, well, what is the purpose of that land? Is it parkland? Is that national park? Or is there third party rights and interests there, private corporation, government? That means that there is no new development happening there. So what you want to do is look at that suburb from a bird's eye view and determine whether or not there is land abundance, and then if there is land abundance, what is the purpose of that land in the future, right? And that is very easy to do, and that's one way to establish if a suburb is scarce or not, based on by looking at it from a bird's eye point of view. And that's really good to do and easy to do, guys. And then what you want to do then is look for suburbs where there is limited supply threat. So you might see that land abundance, and what you might actually find is that that land is earmarked for future residential development. So as far as the eye can see, there's stage 1, 2, 3, 4, up to 10 of a master plan development, or a developer just rolling out new supply for year after year after year until that land is completely built out. And you can generally find this information by looking at suburb level building approvals. So if you find building approvals, very, very high in a particular suburb, that's when you know that, oh crap, there is a whole new pipeline of supply here in the marketplace? And is that supply going to be an immediate threat to my asset that I target in the suburb? And what we find is that when there is a bunch of supply or supply threats, that has a tendency to be the enemy of capital growth, certainly. So apply the scarcity lens when you are evaluating a suburb. And then as you drill deeper into the layers of the suburb, if you apply the same lens, you're going to, more often than not, find yourself in the better locations or the better pockets, the better streets, and then you're narrowing in on the better assets. And once you can tick all of those boxes, you're positioning your investment there to be, in that top 10% of the assets in that immediate suburb. So scarcity is a really good one here, guys. Now, trait number three we're looking at when we're analyzing, the nature of a suburb and whether or not it is an investment grade suburb is we're looking at the demographic makeup. And we want the demographic makeup to mainly consist of what we call the upper middle class demographic. And that's generally the best way to define that is where individuals or household incomes exceed more than 140,000 per year for individuals, or combined household income of $280,000 a year. And that's how you'd best define sort of that upper middle class demographic. And what we're actually finding is that the upper middle class demographic, majority of them have the capacity to purchase property from as low as 450, depending on their taste, up to as high as $1 million or above. So these areas provide sort of a great market depth when it comes to sort of the demographic that lives there, and we like that because it provides the greatest level of market stability, and it shows to me that there is a lot of upside potential and elasticity in incomes there to keep growing, and that growing income obviously sustains a rising median house price. So when you have people that are generally in the upper middle class demographic that have those higher than average incomes than the Australian median, they're generally in better paid jobs. And what comes with these better paid jobs is better employers, more compensation, better remuneration. So that means that year on year, their income is actually rising. And as long as their incomes are rising relatively good compared to how the median house price is rising, there's a lot of upside then in that marketplace. So we like to target areas that have the upper middle class demographic. And this upper middle class demographic generally shops around in markets where prices can vary from, as low as 450,000 up to, $1.2 million. And then above $1.2 million, you start to move into sort of, your upper class demographic where household incomes are a lot greater than that $280,000 per household. But yeah, the reason why, we like that, and look, I'm under no illusion that there are a lot of lower socioeconomic areas in regional Queensland that have boomed and are still booming to this day. And I'm under no illusion of that. And in fact, we've invested in a lot of those areas where there is, a lot of sort of blue collar or lower socioeconomic demographic. We've made a lot of money. But what I like is that when you move from that demographic into this demographic, you get a lot more stability, a lot more security. Those lower socioeconomic areas tend to sort of follow up and down ebbs and flows, whereas these areas where there is a strong clustering upper middle class demographic tend to just chip away and trend along nicely. So when we're looking at investments for safe havens to park your money, particularly those with a lower risk appetite, we're looking for areas like this because they provide the greatest market stability, I believe, this particular demographic, and a lot of elasticity there in the marketplace to sustain ongoing capital growth. So when you are looking for suburbs that have the upper middle class demographic predominantly, what you want to look for is your household income data, so you can get that from the Australian Tax Office. I think Economics ID can provide you with household income data at a suburb level or LGA level as well, and you'll be able to determine if that area has a high clustering of upper middle class demographic. And look, the whole suburb doesn't have to necessarily be upper middle class. What we want to find is that is a large cross section of the suburb in that upper middle class demographic, or at least 60 or 70%. rather than sort of only 20 or 30% of that suburb being consistent of upper middle class. What we want is a larger percentage of that suburb sitting in that upper middle class demographic. And you can easily tell if you aren't looking at household income data that the suburb consists of upper middle class demographic by looking at other things such as like the quality of housing stock. So in in these better areas, what you'll actually find is the houses are a little bit nicer, right? They have better finishes, they have pools, they have larger land parcels. Those are the things that suggest to me and are easy to pick, and that allows you to then determine that, hey, I'm in an area where there is this upper middle class demographic, and that's where they want to live and are shopping for property, right? So that's one way to look at it, guys. And another thing you can do is look at sort of the house price variation of that particular suburb as well, and that could determine, whether or not that suburb has some nice price elasticity there, and that shows me that there is a large portion of that upper middle class demographic there. And what you want to do is find that house price variation where it sits anywhere between sort of 200,000 to 400,000. And what I mean by that is that, let's just say you're looking at a suburb like Frenchville in Rockhampton, for example, quite a nice suburb. A large portion of that suburb is made up of the upper middle class demographic. And what you'll actually find there, if you put the properties on the market there right now on a range from lowest to highest, what you'll actually find is that on the low end, there might be a property selling right now for 480,000, and then on the high end, a property might be selling for like 800,000. So what you can see there is there was a lot of price elasticity or variation there. So that suggests to me that the suburb has a really good demographic makeup because you have property prices a lot higher than properties that are sitting on the lower end of the market. And we really like that because as you get closer and closer to those properties and areas where there is a lot more of that higher quality housing stock, particularly if you bought something for, let's say, 550, and in the same pocket and on the same streets you have houses that are selling for upwards of $800,000. That's when you know you've narrowed in on some really good areas there, and you're narrowed in on areas where this upper middle class demographic is shopping and is buying, and then that upper middle class demographics are the ones that are driving that market, that continue to drive up prices because their incomes are quite healthy and property prices are moving, and then you have your little house there moving relative to how these other houses are moving along. So if an $800,000 house goes to $1 million over a 5-year period, and your house on that same street, you bought it at 550, then the likelihood of that going from 550 to 750 also is very high as well. So that's why we really like to apply this to our suburb framework, is looking at the demographic makeup of a suburb. The fourth trait we've come to see being very important for investment grade assets is suburbs that have stock that's built between 20 or 40 years ago. So properties that were built 20 or 40 years ago, not necessarily before the last 20 years and not necessarily after the last 40 years. Because what we find is that the properties that are built between sort of the last 10 to 15 years, even the last 1 to 10 years, tend to sit in the suburbs where there is a lot of new development happening. So these are on the sort of urban fringe of these regional hubs, and that's where the new developers are pumping out house and land packages, and that's where the properties that were built recently generally sit, right? And the properties that are built between sort of 20 and 40 years ago tend to be in the more established areas where you're well buffered from that current pipeline of supply. So that's why we like to target these houses that are sort of 20 to 40%. And then when we're looking at 20 to 40 years, and then we're looking at houses that are older than 40 years, what you'll actually find across regional Queensland is that a lot of these houses that are 40 plus years old tend to be either cottages or old Queensland homes, so old Queensland as they call them. And unfortunately, from an investment perspective, these houses more often than not aren't necessarily the best investments, unless you have an appetite to sort of renovate, develop, do things like that. But as a sort of buy and hold, set and forget strategy, those assets generally aren't the best because they require more maintenance, they require renovation, cosmetic work. to get them up to the point in time where you're maximizing its value for rental returns and then really maximizing its value for sort of manufactured equity, so to speak. And look, it's not to say there's a lot of people out there not making money. I mean, I know heaps of people, particularly flippers. We work with a lot of flippers across regional Queensland and developers that find these older cottages in Queenslanders, for 300,000, and they put $100,000 into them, and then they sell them for like 600,000, 700,000. Because what you'll actually find is that a lot of those older homes, post 40 or older than 40 years, sorry, are in pretty good established locations, generally around the sort of inner middle ring of a lot of the regional hubs. But then there are also some that are in sort of very undesirable parts on the very inner middle part of the CBDs, particularly around Bundy. You've got like heaps of older Queenslanders and cottages around the CBD. Same would go for Rockhampton, same would go for Mackay. So, there are some really rough pockets in and around like the CBDs that have this older stock. And that's by and large because obviously when these cities were first established, all of the older properties were obviously the first ones built around that sort of immediate CBD area, and they still exist there to this day. Many of them have been cleared out and made way for sort of, buildings and apartments and government infrastructure, private industry infrastructure. So a lot of it has been sort of knocked down and built on over the years, but there is still a lot of really old stock that's been built before 40 years ago, longer than 40 years ago, sorry, that we wouldn't necessarily buy as sort of an investment grade asset. So we like to target these assets that are between 20 to 40 years old. And the reason why we're targeting these ones is because, again, they tend to sit in these areas that aren't necessarily as close to the city, where the older stock exists. They're sort of on the fringe of the CBD within that sort of 10 to 15 kilometer radius where the developers have built these master planned estates and areas, 20, 30 years ago. And now these areas are leafy green. They're established and completely built out. And the stock there is not your brand new bells and whistles, but the stock there is still pretty solid, like brick and tile homes, where you probably won't get the depreciation benefits, but you still will likely to inherit an investment that is still pretty rock solid, particularly if it's been built in the last 20 or 30 years. And what I tell a lot of the investors these days as well is properties that were built 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, they're a lot more sturdier than the stuff they're building today. Like, I know that the Queensland government and the Australian government really ain't on about building standards, but I know there's heaps of builders out there in the regional market just cutting corners and slapping these sort of 4-bedroom, 2-bathroom properties together with like Bunnings material more than anything. So I really like that older established stock because I think they're a bit more sturdy and they're built, to a higher quality. And that's what you want with an investment, particularly for those set and forget investment. You want those sturdy homes that are reliable and that you can hold for a long period of time without any major cost outlay. So this data I think is really important. If you can target these areas where stock is between that 20, 40 years old, I think those suburbs are the best ones. And obviously, like every suburb is going to be different. There will be, pockets of that suburb where there is very, very old stock. But what you want to try to do is say, well, that's where the very, very old stock is. I want to try and move into the pocket of the suburb where, the homes are sort of 20 or 30 years old as opposed to 60, 70 plus years old. Because what you'll actually find is that there might be some variation with their times in terms of when they're built. Some might be built a long time ago, some might be built relatively recent. So I would try and stick to those particular pockets of the suburb. But for the most part, yeah, if you can find those suburbs where at least 80% of the stock there have been built in the last 20 to 40 years, I think, those are the ones that are all round more desirable, and I think they have the best investment upside. So things to look out for if you are trying to find these sort of suburbs is number one, established master plan estates. And I just mentioned that before. Like developers 20, 30 years ago would have come and identified an area within a sort of 10, 15-minute radius from the CBD and these regional hubs, and they've gone on and master plan these communities. And now, 10, 15 years, 20 years later, they're fully leafy green, fully established now, and are quite really nice residential areas, good parklands, good roads with curb and channeling now, walkways, lighting, sufficient lighting. So these master plan communities I find are really nice as well, and they have a lot of really good lifestyle drivers and public amenity clustered into them as well, particularly those older master plan communities. So they're really good. Look for those. And like some examples would be like if we were to look at Bundy, like a master plan community on the Bundy fringe would maybe be like somewhere like that's an established uh, master plan community would be like Avoca, right, in Bundaberg's north. Somewhere in Rockhampton would be a place like Norman Gardens, has a lot of established master planned estates within that suburb. Then if you move to Mackay, maybe somewhere like Bocasia that has some established master planned estates in there now that are 20 plus years old. Townsville, somewhere like maybe uh, Adalia in the non-flood area. Adalia is a bit controversial, but it has a lot of really nice public amenity in there, really good quality stock. But it was flood affected. But that's a nice big sort of master planned community, which snakes you through some really good public walkways, some lakes in between there as well, some really nice access to the CBD, some commercial thrown in there as well, restaurant shops, cafes. So that's one to look out for. What's another one in Townsville? Maybe Birdell as well is moving into that as sort of established master plan community. I know there's still a bit of a pipeline of supply there though in Birdell, but you have to look out for. Maybe Bowley Plains, I think, is maybe a better example of like a more established master plan community. And it's somewhere like Cairns, I'd probably look at places like established master plan, Blentley Park on the south side, places like maybe Smithfield and Redlynch on the inner north, and then obviously out on the Cairns Northern Beaches, you've got some old established areas like Kawara Beach and Trinity Beach as well. So look for those sort of older established master plan areas, and I think more often than not you're going to find that stock there is between that 20 to 40 years old, and yeah, I think they're the better picks in the marketplace for sort of that better capital growth and that more sort of sturdy asset, because the more newer stock, like everyone has their preferences. But what I find is that the newer stock tends to be in these areas where there is a pipeline of new supply. So yes, you might get some depreciation benefits and things like that. You might get a newer property. But in saying that, yeah, you're also setting yourself up there to have a plethora of competition there with a whole bunch of new supply. So we tend to sort of stay to those more established, scarce, existing master plan communities, 20, 40 years old. And what you'll actually find is that again, a lot of them are sturdy and they have that brick and tile construction, or there'll be a combination build where you might get a combination of brick and weatherboard or hardy plank. They're very popular in and around Mackay, Rockhampton, Bundaberg, parts of Cairns as well, not necessarily so in Townsville. There's a little bit of combination builds around Townsville, but yeah, those uh, properties, you'll find that they're often not the ones that are built in the last 20 years, 20 to 40 years, have that brick and tile or that combination construction. The ones that are a lot older than 40 years, you'll find they're cottages, timber made out of asbestos, ply, like they're not that sturdy. So just be mindful of that. And then what you'll actually find, particularly if you are researching and you found it and narrowed in on a property, and then you want to see if it falls within that sort of sweet spot between 20 to 40 years, you can actually look at the date of when the property was constructed and be able to sort of backdate that and establish whether or not it sits in that sweet spot between sort of 20 to 40 years. So that's what I would do. I would look at those three things: master plan communities, brick and tile construction or combination builds, and then look at sort of the date of when that property was constructed. And if you could get into that sweet spot, I think yeah, that's where the best assets are in the marketplace. All right, the lucky last trait we're looking at when we're evaluating a suburb and determining whether or not that suburb is right for investing in is we're looking at a suburb that has some sort of X factor to it, right? Something that makes it unique, something that separates it from its competitors, something that makes people want to buy or invest there, right? Live and invest. And it can be made up of a bunch of different things, but what we're generally aiming for is that particular suburb to have all, if it has all of those X factors, fantastic. But if it's ticking one or two, uh, we're still okay with that. But it needs to have an X factor of some sort, right? So the first X factor we're looking at is affordability, right? So, there might be a suburb out there that is scarce, right? That is owner has really good owner occupier appeal. A suburb that has all of these, properties that are built in the last 20 to 40 years, but it's not affordable, right? So it's not worth your while. It's not. What's the point of even investing there if I can't get in for my $550,000 budget? So we need to ensure that it's ticking all of those other boxes, but at the same time, it offers that affordability, right? It offers that affordability, and is it affordable for that upper middle class demographic, but also investors and middle class, right? Because they make up a big portion of the market depth as well. But affordability, I think, is a really good X factor, particularly when we're looking at bridesmaid suburbs, you like to call them. You'll have one suburb next to a more expensive suburb. They're very similar in nature. They have all the same fundamentals. They're ticking all the same boxes, but yours might be $100,000 to $150,000 cheaper to get into. And I've been saying that with a suburb in Rockhampton right now. You're going back 12 months ago, a suburb called Frenchville really boomed, right? It went crazy, and it saw upwards of 40% growth over the last couple of years. And you could have bought a Frenchville for around that 350 mark, and now you're probably looking at around sort of 550. So around $200,000 worth of growth. Now, in its neighbouring suburb in Park Avenue, what you'll actually find is that you could potentially still get into Park Avenue for around that $450,000 mark. So you're about $100,000 cheaper in its neighbouring suburb to get into. And this is also a really good thing, particularly if that neighbouring suburb is ticking, 4 out of the other 5 boxes, and then it's ticking the affordability box, right? And affordability is always going to be relative to, the neighbouring suburb and relative to what your budget is as well. But affordability as an X factor is something that's really good, because what we can see there is, a suburb like Park Avenue potentially in the short term getting from 450 to 550. So there is wiggle room in there to at least make some really good short-term gains. And then obviously, providing that suburb has the same long-term fundamentals and ticking all 4 of these other boxes, then we know, right, that it will have a good run long term. So affordability is important. Amenity, so we're looking at X factor like amenity. So what amenity does that suburb offer? Is it close to some really good public infrastructure that's free, that makes people want to live in that particular area? Lifestyle is an important one. Is the suburb close to the beach, right? So that's a really big lifestyle driver, and obviously that gives it that X factor. Is it close to really good parklands and walking tracks, bike tracks for people to have that outdoor recreation lifestyle? So that gives it that X factor over a suburb that doesn't have those sort of qualities about them and those sort of X factors. And then we're looking at things that are location X factor, that gives it that location X factor, proximity to the CBD, proximity to those lifestyle drivers, proximity to those key amenity, right? Those sort of things. We're really looking at that suburb and going, well, what X factor does it have? Because more often than not, when you get a suburb that has an X factor versus a suburb that doesn't, I'll bet my house on every day of the week, the suburb with the X factor is likely to perform better in the short, medium, and long term than the suburb that doesn't have the X factor. So you can look out for all of those things, right? Affordability, obviously that's going to be relative to your budget, but the best way to to look at affordability is say, well, the suburb that I can afford to get into, right, is the neighbouring suburbs around it more expensive, right? And if so, then that means that, all right, well, that means that my suburb, given its proximity to those neighbouring suburbs that are more expensive, is likely to have a lot of the same fundamentals. So you're looking at it relative to the neighbouring suburbs, and then obviously your budget. Amenity, that's pretty hard. pretty easy to look at, particularly if you're on the ground. Like you can kind of know, well, this suburb has, this sort of public infrastructure. It's close to this, close to that. If you're out of town, it might be very hard to establish what the local amenities are. But my pick would be to, if you're looking at a property, read the descriptions. So agents would often say, what it's close to, some amenity, has some access to amenity that particular property would give you or that suburb would give you. Or just get on the phone and just ask agents some questions, and that's the best way you'd be able to get sort of that market insight. Lifestyle, if you're close to the beach and you're close to sort of a lot of the parklands and walking tracks, like that's pretty easy. Most agents will sell that as part of their sales pitch to you anyway, so you'd be able to gauge those lifestyle drivers pretty quick. But if you aren't on the ground, then just doing some sort of suburb research, qualitative research, I think very quickly you'd be able to sort of establish pretty fast, what are these lifestyle drivers. Even if you wanted to join like the local Townsville property forums or the local Townsville residents forums and say, hey, look, I'm a buyer, I'm looking at investing in Bowley Plains, can you tell me a bit about, that suburb and what you like about it? And they'll give you a bunch of amenity options, lifestyle options, etc. And then from location, obviously, that's both qualitative and quantitative as well. So you'd be able to sort of gauge pretty quickly if you're in a well-located area that has X factor based on its price, based on a bunch of other qualitative and quantitative aspects there as well, guys. But yeah, if your property doesn't have if your suburb doesn't have all of these 5 traits, yeah, more often than not, what you'll find yourself is in an area where you're less likely to get that really good ongoing capital growth and have that long-standing market stability and certainty. Oh, I'm buggered after that. I don't know about you guys, but look, I appreciate you if you hung around all the way to the end and you enjoyed this content. If you actually got any questions or queries, leave a comment in the comment section, and I'll circle back and hopefully get those answered for you if I have an answer. What do I want to say? If you are an investor, again, as I said at the start of the preso, you need help, you are still struggling, like you're getting all this information, but you're not doing anything with it or not taking action, or you're still reluctant to take action, or you are and you're missing out, then give us a call, book an appointment, with me and my team, and then let's just have a chat. Let's just see what's going on, see what you're trying to achieve, and then see what we offer helps you, get one step closer to that, goal or outcome that you seek. And who knows, we might be able to help you do that. If not, we can at least try and steer you in the right direction at the same time as well, guys. But yeah, thank you for hanging around, guys. My name is Troy Samasini, and I'll see you on the next video.